Myths about disasters.
On balance, sometimes these things are not harmful to the economy.
Gee, then I should do this. And also,
you've got these super PACs that are just going crazy.
Myths about elections.
Do you want to have an auto industry or do you want it to go bankrupt?
There we go. Myths. That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
Tonight we explode a few myths about elections and natural disasters. Here's the first. I'm told Hurricane Sandy's proof we need a powerful federal government, namely FEMA, which provides emergency management. This just makes sense to people. Big disaster across state lines, who but the feds can help? As the New York Times declared this week, a big storm requires big government. Very few politicians are skeptical about that, so it's a relief to turn to former presidential candidate Ron Paul. Dr. Paul, you say it's a myth that we need FEMA?
I certainly think so, because it causes more harm than good. We've handled floods and disasters for 204 years before we had FEMA. And the states and the volunteers and local communities did quite well. You know, I've taken this position for a long time. It's not just recently. And I've taken it since I was first in office. And I kept getting reelected because people in my district got tired of FEMA. All they had were headaches. They get locked into their insurance, and it's a bureaucracy, and I'd try to help them get through the bureaucracy. But they just come in and take over.
But it's a big problem. It crosses state lines. Don't the feds have to have some role?
No, they don't have to. What we should have is, a real insurance. The problem is the insurance program causes many of the problems, because they say, well, you have to have insurance. The market won't. They won't sell it to you. Well, that's telling you something that is too dangerous. So rich people get insurance subsidized by poor people, and they go and build on beaches, and they have a good time, and their houses get washed away, and the poor people pay to rebuild their houses.
Well, it was interesting that this week, before the storm hit, the president held a press conference not at FEMA's offices, but at the Red Cross. Here's a clip.
The reason we're here is because the Red Cross knows what it's doing when it comes to emergency response.
So what's he saying there? The Red Cross, not FEMA, knows what it's doing? FEMA doesn't? Sounds like he's admitting it.
That was good politics, but unfortunately, from my experience here in my district, Red Cross and others were inhibited by FEMA. They would come in and stop it. Think about the difference between how the evacuation occurred in New York after 9/11, all the volunteer boats and things, thousands of people, they were evacuated. And the opposite happened in Katrina, because the FEMA got in and had control. But, this giving up on individuals, helping neighbors and local government doing things, that is a serious problem. And it's one of the reasons why we're totally bankrupt, because all this money that's going to go out here in the next few months because of this storm, there is no money in the bank, and there's no money really in FEMA. Insurance is broke, so they're going to just borrow it and print it and make our problems worse. Take it and centralize the power. The power will be in Washington, in Washington D.C., and it's bureaucratic and it's very inefficient.
Well, thank you, Dr. Paul, and thank you for all you've done to wake people up.
Thank you, John.
I fear he, though, and I won't have much success convincing people that we need less federal emergency management. As I argue in that book, even though government fails, when problems are big, our instinct leads us to assume the experts in Washington have the best tools. But they don't. They fail all the time. FEMA fails constantly. Years ago, after Hurricane Hugo, one senator called FEMA's management a bunch of bureaucratic jackasses that should just get the hell out of the way. So they said they'd improve it. But 3 years later, after Hurricane Andrew hit, even the New York Times reported it was unclear just who was in charge of the federal relief effort. Senator Barbara Mikulski said government's response was seen by many hurricane victims as a disaster itself. Again, they said they'd fix it. Then came Katrina. Almost 2,000 people died. FEMA often got in the way of rescue efforts. The Astor Hotel hired buses to carry guests to high ground. FEMA took the buses and sent the guests to the convention center, which turned out to be its own disaster. Walmart offered flood victims 3 trailer trucks filled with water. FEMA turned them away. FEMA prevented the Coast Guard from delivering 1,000 gallons of fuel. FEMA even ordered 91,000 tons of ice for hurricane victims, but then shipped it to places like Maine and Arizona. Government bureaucracies always become incompetent, even if they're brilliant when they're conceived. Over time, because everyone has to follow the bureaucracy's mind-numbing rules, they become incompetent. But Tara McGinnis says I'm wrong. She and the Center for American Progress and most people say we need FEMA. But Tara, they're not competent. They're a bureaucracy.
John, thank you for having me on. You know, I'm not going to argue about tit for tat when FEMA has done well or had failed, but I think most people think when we're in a crisis, when there are floods, when there are fires, when they're worried about their children and their safety, that the government has an important role. I mean, people don't call Walmart, they call 911 in these situations, and they expect firefighters and first responders and backup from their government. That's why we pay taxes.
911's local government.
Yeah, and what FEMA does, as you very well know, is that in cases like Hurricane Sandy we saw this week, the local government is the first responders, the first to act. But in fact, that when we have a major crisis, like a superstorm that we've seen, that local governments, you know, Governor Chris Christie calls in, checks in with FEMA and says, here's what we need to back us up. FEMA moves behind local governments. Local governments lead. They're the responders of first resort. Well, when we have huge crises, you know, as you've seen this week, there are some things that that warrant a huge, big response, and I think FEMA has stepped in. And if you look in this week in particular, people who believe we need smaller government and bigger government, people who disagree in other political arenas, are all saying the president and FEMA are doing a really great job.
Okay, that's logical. It's what most people believe. But economist Steve Horowitz has researched disasters. He says the private sector helps more people. Really?
It does. It does. It does. When we look at what firms like Walmart and Lowe's and Marriott and McDonald's did in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, they were major forces for good in getting resources to people who needed them in very desperate times.
All right, they help, but FEMA is the most important part.
Well, we know from what happened during Katrina, as you were discussing earlier, FEMA was an absolute disaster that made that disaster worse. FEMA didn't get into New Orleans in some cases for a week or 10 days. They helped people get trailers that turned out to be toxic. And as you've told your viewers, they blocked a lot of help that was coming in.
All right, let's move on to this hurricane. 295 Walmarts were hit by Sandy. 250 were open within 24 hours. They're impressive.
Yeah. Yes, and it was the same thing that they did during Katrina. And Walmart's really effective at doing this because Walmart is really good at moving resources. That's what they do, you know, every day of the year. So they're able to get resources into places that are when their stores go down, they can get resources in and get them up running again really quick.
Listen, I agree with Stephen. I read his study. I think it's one very interesting case study of in a complete disaster, in a complete failure of FEMA, where Walmart stepped in and I think Stephen points out Home Depot as well, in 2 communities, was able to deliver hard goods. But I think if you look at the comprehensive things that happen in a disaster, delivering water and toilet paper to citizens is one particular aspect of it. There are security and safety aspects to it. When you look at a place like New York right now, and you have huge amounts of flooding, or in New Jersey, you have toxins that get released into the water. There's a bunch of things that I think Walmart is not qualified to do. And again, if you look at Walmart,
what's your response?
Walmart's working at, you know, someone has to tell Walmart where to go.
Steve?
No, actually, they don't have to tell Walmart where to go. Walmart knew where their stores were damaged, knew where they could get goods in.
What about the police role? Don't we need FEMA?
Look, Well, there's a difference between FEMA and the police. In the earlier discussion, the point was made that disaster response is most effective locally, and that's true. And there's no doubt that local police and local folks who have local knowledge about those communities are, in fact, the best responders and best first responders. But FEMA is a bureaucracy. It's situated in Washington. It doesn't understand very well, or as well, the needs of local communities.
Can I just ask you something, Stephen? Because I found your study fascinating. The case that you make goes back to a very old economist, Hayek, right? And he suggested that this is what the market, Walmart has a special type of knowledge that the government doesn't have because Walmart understands the market. But in fact, and you point this out in your report, the market, Walmart was giving out these goods for free. So the kind of market indicators that usually would give these companies the extra edge that the government doesn't have, I don't understand how that economic theory applies in a case where Walmart's giving things out for free.
They were selling goods and they were giving goods away for free. And one of the reasons they were giving goods away for free is they understand that that their employees live in those communities, and that by helping people in those communities, they're ultimately helping themselves.
So even though they're greedy people who just want to make a profit, they help people?
I think that there's a lot. I think it's really overblown to suggest that, it's not a binary choice that we have in the real world.
Right.
It's not a world where companies run the world or the government runs the world.
Well, government increasingly looks like it's running the world. We're out of time. Thank you, Steve and Tara. Coming up, price gouging. You probably think it's a terrible thing, right? Well, I say what you call gouging is good. It even saves lives. I'll explain that next. We've got lights in the studio, electricity. It's wonderful. But just to the south, they don't. About a fourth of Manhattan is still dark, so people need flashlights. This morning we found a store selling flashlights for $30. We bought one. Here it is, my $30 flashlight. See, it says right here on this, $30, $29.99. Are you kidding me? That store must have raised its prices just because of the storm. It was trying to gouge customers, taking advantage of a disaster. That's evil and illegal in 31 states.
Businesses cannot use Hurricane Sandy as an excuse to make an unfair profit. If you see this happening, you're asked to call the Attorney General's office.
New York's Attorney General put out a press release warning businesses, you better not gouge. New Jersey's Chris Christie tweeted, anyone found to have violated the law will face significant penalties. Yeah, lock them up. But economist Art Carden says, no, this is just stupid thinking. What politicians call gouging is really a good thing. So, Art, why?
Well, John, this is straight off of the economics exam that my students are getting ready for right now. Prices send very, very, very valuable signals about what's really, really scarce, what's really, really needed, and what is really, really, really hard to come by in disaster-prone areas. Prices allow us to engage in a kind of economic triage, where when we see the price of a $30 flashlight, we might think twice about some of the silly things we might do with flashlights and say, well, maybe we should pass on this one and leave those flashlights for people who really, really need them. When we have price controls, we create shortages. In other words, people want far more flashlights than people are willing to bring to the market at the controlled price. When we let the price rise, it's like a signal flare that says, bring flashlights to New York, bring flashlights to New Jersey, bring flashlights to places where they're really, really needed.
Chris Christie, I thought he's a free market guy. He doesn't get this? He wants to lock people up?
Apparently he doesn't. Apparently stuff that is basic economics is a little bit too advanced for the governor of New Jersey.
Now, one other point. The store that sold us this $30 flashlight wasn't having an easy time. They didn't have power. They were pumping water from their basement at the time. So I could see why they would want to charge extra just to remain open. Yet they could be fined $25,000 if they raised the price. They claimed they didn't, that they always sold it for $30.
Right. That's an important point. For the store owner, it's pretty obvious that they've got some other issues to deal with, like pumping out their basement. By allowing the signal flare that prices are, by allowing prices to rise, we send a signal to the person who could sell the flashlight that, hey, there are a lot of people who want flashlights now. Would you please divert your attention from some other things you could be doing to making sure that people in New York have flashlights?
One example from Hurricane Katrina. After the hurricane, John Shepherdson of Kentucky bought 19 generators. He and his family then rented a U-Haul, drove 600 miles to part of Mississippi that had no power, offered to sell his generators for twice what he paid for them. People were eager to buy, but the police arrested him, confiscated his generators, and he stayed in jail for 4 days. I mean, who wins from that?
Well, with friends like that, the people in Mississippi don't need enemies. As an economist, I think these people should be lauded as heroes. Why? Because they're taking scarce resources from areas of relatively low need to areas of relatively high need. In the case of the generators, nobody got generators after the guy was arrested.
But what about the poor? When you allow people to raise prices, and maybe that's the only reason I was able to get a flashlight, the poor are cut out. Rich people win.
But merely passing a law saying you're not allowed to charge more than, say, $10 for the flashlight, that's not going to guarantee that poor people get flashlights. In fact, a law against price gouging is going to prevent people from bringing more flashlights to the market ultimately.
Which would bring the price down and make them more accessible to poor people. Thank you, Art Carden.
Sure.
Hooray for price gouging. I would just call it flexible prices. Coming up, election myths, and also how I, thanks to a disaster myth, personally ripped you off and got to live in this beach house. Now let's expand our debate about myths to myths about the election Tuesday. I'm told the president will be chosen this year by a small percentage of still undecided voters. Who are these people? A Huffington Post column says they're idiots. And this is a common belief. If you do a Google search on the word undecided, Google now helpfully prompts you to search undecided voters are idiots. So are they? I suspect they are if they still haven't decided by now, but both my guests, who are smarter than I and who research this, say it's a myth that the undecided voters are dumb. Matt Welch is editor-in-chief of Reason magazine. Ira Stoll edits the blog Future of Capitalism. So, Ira, I understand you're undecided. You must be an idiot.
Well, I don't hold myself out as some kind of genius, but I went to Harvard. I follow this stuff for a living, and I don't like to make my decision until I step right into the polling booth. I mean, maybe I'm just a procrastinator.
Follow it for a living, so you pay attention. There must be, you've learned enough.
Learned enough to know that there are flaws with both of the candidates, and that it's simpler than just voting for the one who's going to save us from all the trouble.
And, Matt, there is actual research on this about who these people are, and they're not dumb?
Not at all, actually. The Associated Press came out with a poll in October, and it showed, and this is consistent findings to other polling organizations, it showed that undecided voters are more likely to vote. They are more likely to read campaign information. They're more likely to be informed and enthusiastic about the process. They're just undecided.
But the New York Times ran an op-ed about them and headlined it, Idiot's Delight.
Of course, because people who are totally invested in partisan politics, which the New York Times definitely is, tend to think that those who do not share their own proclivities must be somehow dishonest or just not smart.
All right, let's move on to another commonly held belief, and that's that evil super PACs corrupt the election.
You've got these guys writing $10 million checks. You've got these super PACs that are just going crazy.
The headlines say it's a dangerous weapon, an evil.
Well, let's take the broad view here. These are people who are outside of politics trying to influence the way politics is done through this spending their money. What on earth is wrong with that as an idea?
Because they have too much power, the rich.
The people who have too much power are incumbent politicians who win consistently 85, 90% of the time for re-election. One of the only ways to unseat incumbents is to have people willing to spend money to try to run advertisements against them. There are super PACs that are dedicated to bipartisan unseating of incumbents, to inject political competition. We wouldn't have had a long Republican primary at all if it wasn't for the existence of super PACs backing Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, making it more competitive. We should all be invested in political competition. Super PACs are a way to have more and not less competition.
And there are plenty of ways for rich people to lose elections. I mean, we'd have President Perot, we'd have California Governor Meg Whitman if just having more money won the election.
And just to be clear about the money, the super PACs are spending more than $1 billion this year. But the campaigns are spending $5 billion, and Americans spend $7 billion on potato chips. Now let's move back to disaster myths. We, I'm told, need a federal warning system for disasters like Hurricane Sandy.
You know, I mean, think about the most radical and positive communications breakthrough in possibly history or certainly our lifetimes. It's
my show?
Besides your show, but it's the internet, which is by definition a bottom-up user kind of generated grassroots thing. Internet, and then also cell phones, where you can have a communications device that you carry with you everywhere. This allows people to access real-time information constantly. What did you do during the storm, John? You weren't waiting for Barack Obama to tell you what was going on. You were refreshing Twitter like a madman, probably, or the Drudge Report, or listening to the radio, or looking at the Weather Channel like everybody else. We are all accessing information. We don't need a top-down system to suddenly tell us what we already learned an hour and a half ago.
And actually, during the storm, like a day into it, all the young people in my house got a sudden emergency warning. A big storm is about to hit. It came a day late. And the history of this, it's never been used successfully. In 1971, it issued a false alarm, accidentally played the wrong tape. On September 11th, it was not activated. We heard about that from television and radio. It was tested in November of 2011. It worked on some, but not all, TV and radio stations. Some people heard Lady Gaga music on the system because of some mistake. It's government incompetence, but they spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and nobody is talking about we have to get rid of it.
Well, it's a classic government's creep, right? Emergency response almost always works better at the local level. So if you can hear and know what the special sounds are for, you know, New York kind of disaster relief, then you're much better informed than you are by a president or some kind of federal system.
Thank you, Ira Stoll and Matt Welch. Coming up, I'll debunk a big myth by destroying things. And more election myths. Did you know it's possible on Tuesday that the president and vice president might be from two different parties? Now, more election myths. President Obama's director of opinion research says polls don't matter. I've wondered about that because I've been fooled by polls. In 1980, every pollster missed the Reagan landslide. Is it a myth that polls accurately predict who is likely to win? Let's take that criticism to someone who runs a big polling company, Scott Rasmussen. So polls get trashed all the time.
Of course they get trashed all the time.
So you must be wrong.
Well, they usually get trashed by the team that's losing. They don't like the results, so they say, oh, you can't trust the polls, you know, or we got some secret information somewhere. The truth is, we're shocked when a poll really gets it wrong. In 2008, the entire industry missed Hillary Clinton's win in the New Hampshire primary, and the reason people were shocked is because they've come to expect those things don't happen.
And I must say, I was looking for poll mistakes to hit you with, and there weren't many. You've already named the one that I was about to
well, there was,
to.
you know, there was 1948, but I wasn't around then when Dewey beat Truman.
I assume you've improved since then. So how do you sample?
You know, the theory is you just call 1,000 phone numbers at random and it all works out.
Is that what you do?
No, because first of all, you have to make sure you place a lot more calls into a place like California than Wyoming because there's a whole lot more Californians. We also know that women answer the phone more than men, and older people more than younger people, and whites more than non-whites. So you have to call into areas to make sure you try and get a pretty representative sample. And even when you do all that, you have to do what we call weighting the sample to make sure you have the right mix of men and women, young and old.
So how do you weight a sample?
Well, that's all those old statistics courses that a lot of people hated. But basically the concept is if we know that we're supposed to have 52% of women live in a particular state, we want to make sure that our sample matches out to 52% women.
All right, criticism. I'm told you favor Republicans. Time magazine says you're conservative leaning, and the New York Times 538 blog says Rasmussen polls were biased.
There's always criticism of polls, And it is all the pollster's incentive is always to get it right. I mean, we have nothing to gain by gaming a system.
But if you have a reputation for getting it right, you make more money. People trust you.
That's right. If you have a reputation for getting it right, you get more people mad at you, too.
Going on to his criticisms, you speak with the first person who answers the phone rather than a random selection.
You know, there's an old academic theory about how to do a poll, which back in, the 1960s and 70s, when Gallup and just a few other pollsters, there weren't anywhere near as many pollsters as there are today, they would say, I'd like to speak to the oldest male or the youngest female. They would rotate within a household, and it was a very good technique. Everything has changed since the 1970s and the 80s. You may have heard we have Twitter, we have cable news, we have, a few other things.
So what's it have to do with polling?
It has everything to do with polling. People don't communicate the way they used to. One of the big issues in polling today has to do with cell phones. It's not just a question of...
He says you don't call cell phones.
Actually, we don't. We reach people who have abandoned landlines through an online approach. I mean, I have 2 sons. They don't even know you can talk on a cell phone. They think it's for tweeting and texting. We need to find new ways to reach people where they are communicating. 5 years from now, there will be no more phone polling.
So how do you get the information? I mean, you say the internet, but that's a very select group that might respond or not respond. I don't respond to these people asking me for surveys.
The answer is we don't know. The answer is we're back the way things were in the 1930s when you're trying to experiment with different theories. Our firm this year is going to be doing some polls. We're not going to release these. These are our internal experiments using entirely different techniques so we can measure them up against the election results and see how well we do.
He also says in the 2000 Bush win, you were off, way off, pro-Republican, 5% higher than it was.
You know, we did. We missed in the Bush year. We showed the president winning by, or the then Governor Bush winning by more than he did. We also then went back, and this is the way a pollster works. You compare what you actually found to the actual results, and you learn from it. So by 2004, we were within a 0.5 percentage point of both Bush and Kerry's total. We did miss with Obama. We predicted he would win 52 to 46. He ended up winning 53 to 46.
That's pretty small. And on his behalf, I have to say, I was looking for stuff to confront him with, and those were the only examples I could find.
And look, we make mistakes. Every pollster makes mistakes. It is part of the process. Even polling theory says one result out of every 20 will be off by more than the margin of error. So that it is part of the process, and that's why you want to look at a variety of polls and look for the common ground.
Or even better, given that pollsters can make mistakes, I would say the heck with all you guys and look at the people who bet and the wisdom of crowds. And where people bet on these things, like intrade.com, I'm here, that's the most accurate thing, better than pollsters.
Hey, listen, I trust the wisdom of crowds. I would trust the American people more than their politicians any day of the week. Intrade, though, is driven a lot by conventional wisdom and by polling data. It's a fairly thinly traded market.
So not so much for the presidency.
Not as much, but still relatively thin. Intrade at the end is very, very good. I don't mean to disparage it, but it is not a replacement for polls.
Well, we'll find out in the next few years.
We sure will.
Let's move on to one last myth. Most people assume that the vice president and the president are going to be from the same party. But that may be a myth.
Well, if this year's election ends up in the Electoral College a 269 to 269 tie, it's a long shot, maybe 200 to 1 against. But if that happens, the House picks the president, which would more than likely be Mitt Romney, and the Senate picks the vice president, which would be Joe Biden.
And it's unlikely, but possible. I was surprised looking at the totals how close they've been. Rutherford Hayes won by 1 electoral vote in 1876. More recently, Bush Gore, 5 electoral votes. So this could happen this time.
It could. I think we're headed to a close election. We're headed to a close fight in the Electoral College. And you've got to remember, we have a fragile system. The government today really is struggling to earn the legitimacy of the American people. And the way the election process is playing out is not helping that at all.
Thank you, Scott Rasmussen. Coming up, I'll show you how a big government program, one most people think is good, allowed me to get you to pay for my beach house. What a scam. Also, we'll bust some other myths. Now, a disaster myth and an election myth. I hear from all kinds of people that the destruction produced by Hurricane Sandy might not be bad for our economy.
Sometimes these things are not harmful to the economy because there's so much extra work involved in rebuilding, reconstruction, and rehabilitation.
At least one analyst says the storm could have some long-term benefits.
The benefits of the reconstruction.
The benefits! We've heard that before. Paul Krugman claimed 9/11 might be good for the economy. And after the earthquake in Haiti, Nancy Pelosi said this.
I think that this can be an opportunity for a real boom economy in Haiti.
A real boom. This is an appealing concept for the simple-minded. I want to help America's economy. I really do. So what should I do? Well, I have an idea. I'll do this. So I'm going to create jobs by destroying things. What's wrong with this logic? Well, let's ask economists David Henderson and Sally James. So, Sally, I'll start with you. What's wrong? I'm going to stimulate, create economic activity, just like the hurricane.
It's a waste, isn't it? At some level, we recognize that. If I broke something in this studio without your permission, I'd be arrested. The problem is that even when you kind of, please don't.
I just want to be ready. I want to be convinced that I shouldn't smash things.
When you replace things, it looks like it might add to the economy, but
more activity.
Right, but the resources you use to repair things might otherwise have been used for more creative, more constructive reasons.
Aha, that's the thing that eludes Paul Krugman and Nancy Pelosi and these others, that the money has to come from somewhere.
Right.
And that money would have been spent for something else.
Exactly.
And you both argue that politicians have been wrong about many of their economic points during this campaign.
Absolutely, yeah.
President Obama says he'll stimulate the economy with green jobs. Mitt Romney says with defense jobs.
Right. They both subscribe to this. Absolutely. Same principle. They just spend it on different programs because their priorities are different, or they think their voters' priorities are different. But it's the same concept. If the government gets involved and spends money, then it will create jobs. But it's the same concept as when you smash something. When you take that money, the government takes it from other uses. It takes it from taxpayers, businesses, consumers. It just redistributes resources, doesn't create anything.
So, David, your point is that it may be a good thing to pay more for defense or for green jobs, but it matters how the money's spent?
Well, you should judge it by the outcome. When someone brags that he created 1 million jobs, he's bragging that his program is very expensive, because that's 1 million people who could have been doing something else. So it's always suspect when someone justifies a government program based on jobs created.
All right, let's move on to other myths. I was struck when in the last debate, Mitt Romney said, we need regulation. You can't start a bank in your garage. So what's wrong with that?
Well, actually, as you know, probably Hewlett and Packard did start a major company in their garage. Jobs and Wozniak started Apple in their garage. And so the point is there are lots of companies you can start in garages. He's right, you can't start a bank in your garage, but that's because of regulation. So maybe that should make us question not garages, but regulation.
You ought to be able to start a bank in your garage?
I think so. And by the way, to take a more serious example, Walmart is having all kinds of difficulty starting a bank with various regulations that they're facing. I would love to see the kind of creativity that Walmart could bring to banking. Who knows how much of a boon that might be to us consumers.
Next myth. Government had to save GM. And GM is saved. It's wonderful.
But if the government divested now, they'd be about $25 billion in the hole. And when
so all we hear is that they've been paid back, but in fact, they're $25 billion in the hole, for one thing.
Right, but don't forget, again, they've taken those resources from taxpayers, from consumers are worse off. The economy as a whole is worse off. And it's not so much the auto industry, it's auto industry based in Ohio and Detroit. They might have kind of created more jobs or saved jobs there, but what about the jobs in Tennessee or in Indiana where other car manufacturers are left worse off?
Or Toyota or Honda working in America. It's GM and Chrysler were saved, but it's not like the auto industry or all those jobs would have disappeared.
No, not at all.
It's not even clear that GM and Chrysler wouldn't have been saved. The point is there's bankruptcy. We have airlines that go through bankruptcy even as they fly, and so there's a high probability those companies would still exist and they would be scaled down.
Last myth. Sally, this one for you. We're losing manufacturing jobs. We have to do something.
Politicians love talking about manufacturing. It's almost a fetish they have that somehow making things you can drop on your foot is more valuable than services. It's a myth for a few reasons. First of all, on one level, the American economy is largely a service-based economy. Most people and most kind of economic resources are devoted to making things you can't necessarily see.
That's terrible. If you can't see it, it's not real.
Exactly. But in fact, a dollar earned in services is no less valuable than a dollar earned in manufacturing. The other problem is it's simply not true. Manufacturing is doing quite well.
Yeah, we have a chart of that, and manufacturing output is actually increased. But the politicians don't get this.
Well, they may get it, but they don't want to say it. Manufacturing is huge in some of the swing states. It's big in the swing states. Politically, yes.
Thank you, Sally James and David Henderson. Up next, how politicians' bad economics got you to pay to replace my beach house. Years ago, I decided to build a beach house. My father told me, "Are you nuts? It's on the edge of an ocean. All that stands between you and ruin is some sand. Don't do it. It's foolish to build next to an ocean." But I built anyway. Why? Because as my builder said, I couldn't lose. If the ocean took my house, Uncle Sam would pay to replace it. Really? Well, yes, under that program called National Flood Insurance. You even have to pay for their ads.
Hey, dude, got flood insurance? Go online to floodsmart.gov.
Floodsmart.gov? How about floodstupid.gov? Because of government flood insurance, which guaranteed that I couldn't lose, I built a beach house. There it is. That's younger me up there on the deck. I did have to pay insurance premiums to the government, but they were cheap, a few $100 a year. Now, why would Uncle Sam offer me cheap insurance on this house built on sand? I once asked the head of FEMA about that. James Lee Witt ran FEMA for Bill Clinton at the time. He told me if this insurance wasn't here, people would build in those areas anyway, and then it would cost taxpayers more. That's government logic. Since we always bail out everyone, let's get some money up front by selling insurance. Doesn't it occur to the politicians that there's a reason why private insurers are reluctant to offer cheap insurance on the edges of oceans or rivers? No. The politicians, in their arrogance, said the private insurers just want too much profit. But floods are a rare event. A government insurance program won't lose money. Our experts will price it correctly. As usual, they were wrong. Government has lost your money. The program's billions in the red even before this week's storm. Compounding the evil, government insurance encourages us to build on the edges of oceans or rivers. Government's now the biggest underwriter of property insurance. The sweet deal goes to movie stars in Malibu, to rich people who vacation near the summer homes Mitt Romney, George Bush, John Kerry, and the Kennedy family compound in Hyannis have. Now, we taxpayers are on the hook for more than $1 trillion. At least they've now put limits on the payouts. They'll only pay you $250,000. And after your house floods 4 times, they won't cover you anymore. Yippee! Nevertheless, the politicians are still so generous with your money that they didn't raise my premiums when shortly after I built my house, this happened. A storm surge swept away my first floor. You then bought me a new first floor. Thanks. I never invited you to my beach house, but you paid. I really appreciate it. I asked the head of FEMA why taxpayers should have to pay for my new first floor. He said, should we just walk away and say we're not going to help you? Well, yeah, government should walk away and let us risk takers take risks with our own money. Then I would have thought more carefully about where I'd build. By the way, a few years later, another storm took out my whole house. Everything was gone. I was upset, but financially I made out fine. You paid again, this time for the whole house. I'm not proud I took your money, but I thought, what am I going to do, turn it down? If government's dumb enough to give me money, I'd be a sucker not to take it. But I won't do it again. I sold the property, and I think I'm more responsible now. Or at least I won't rip you off on federal flood insurance. I do collect Medicare, and that money's based on an unsustainable pyramid scheme. So is Social Security. Soon I'll collect that. And government guarantees my savings accounts and money market account, and my farm, if I had one. And then there's Obamacare. Everywhere, kind and generous politicians offer guarantees that seem to make us safer, but they really make us less safe because they destroy personal responsibility. They invite people to be reckless. When I confront beachfront homeowners about flood insurance, they yell at me. One said, our beach community produces jobs for chefs and waiters. Give me a break. That's as dumb as Vice President Biden saying this.
You're telling me we got to go spend money to keep from going bankrupt? The answer is yes, I'm telling you.
Wow, spend to keep from going bankrupt. Doesn't he understand that that money comes from somewhere? By their logic, we should just go around and smash things. I'll do it. We got to educate these people. That's our show. We'll be back next week.